y'all, it's Kay from the Literary Apothecary, and welcome back to my channel. Welcome back to another episode of Bibliotherapy Sunday. Today's episode, I'm going to be talking about one of my favorite classic writers who I feel like is underappreciated in the classic world, and that is John Steinbeck. So my first experience of John Steinbeck was way back in middle school, and it builds the foundation for why John Steinbeck is kind of a comfort writer for me as a reader. So back in middle school, I read The Pearl, which is a novella by John Steinbeck. It's a story of classic simplicity based on a Mexican folk tale. The Pearl explores the secrets of man's nature, greed, the darkest depths of evil, and the luminous possibilities. We've got Kino, who is our main character, and he's a pearl diver. He hasn't been doing very well as a pearl diver, but one day he discovers a huge pearl that is, quote, perfect as the moon. And with this pearl, he gets hope and the promise of comfort and security for his young family. And the pearl kind of opened my eyes to writing about life in a fictional world, to make it feel realistic, to bring in those everyday emotions that John Steinbeck is so good at bringing in, but in such a short time. This is a true novella, less than 100 pages, and it just opened my eyes to a whole different world of writing. As a young aspiring writer, when I was in middle school, I dreamed of being a writer, and coming across John Steinbeck's writing was it just felt like coming home. And every time I read a John Steinbeck book, whether it's a book I've already read or a new book, it just feels like I'm coming home again. So John Steinbeck's writing kind of became comfort reading to me, which is a little odd because of some of his writing tends to be very heavy in themes and emotions, but every time I read John Steinbeck, I just feel like I'm coming home. My next occurrence of John Steinbeck's writing was, of course, Of Mice and Men, which takes place in the 1930s. A lot of his books take place in the 30s when he was writing, and that was one thing that I really loved about Steinbeck's writing, is he wrote his books during the times of when he was writing them, and that to me was unique and inspirational. So Of Mice and Men is, like I said, from the 1930s, takes place in California. We've got George and Lenny. They are migrant workers, both trying to both make a living and also save for the American dream that they always talk about in this book. It's an intimate portrait of two men facing a world marked by petty tyranny, misunderstanding, jealousy, and callousness. And I reread this book, I think it was last year or maybe earlier this year, I can't remember, and I loved it just as much as every time I read this book. It's so hard-hitting, so impactful, and it leaves me feeling both incredibly depressed for our characters, but yet with this weird sense of hopefulness, which I always get from John Steinbeck's writing. His writing is very heavy, like I've said. Some call it depressing because of the themes that he uses in his writing, but something about the way that he writes his characters always leaves me with a sense of hope, even the most depressing stories. So I definitely got that with Of Mice and Men. And one of the things about John Steinbeck's writing is it's often assigned in school writing, or at least when I was in school it was assigned. So my generation has often read or was supposed to read at least one book by John Steinbeck, usually either Of Mice and Men or Grapes of Wrath, which we'll talk about in just a minute. And because of that, a lot of readers today, they don't like the classics. They don't like writers like John Steinbeck because they were forced to read them in school. For me, I loved all of our assigned reading in school, because it was a chance for me to read books as homework, and I took every chance of that. I absolutely loved, I wouldn't say I loved, but I enjoyed almost all of the assigned writing. I didn't hate any of our assigned reading. I soaked it up. I soaked up everything I could get that time, and John Steinbeck is a writer that I fell in love with from the beginning. So the next, of course, occurrence of John Steinbeck's writing that I read was his Pulitzer Prize winning novel, epic novel, The Grapes of Wrath. I feel like both Of Mice and Men and The Grapes of Wrath are both books that if you go back and reread it as an adult outside of the assigned school reading, you'll get a lot more out of it. The Grapes of Wrath chronicles the Dust Bowl migration of the 1930s and tells the story of one Oklahoma farm family, the Jodes, who are driven from their homestead and forced to travel west to California. And this is a drama that is intensely human yet majestic in its scale and moral vision, elemental yet plain-spoken, tragic but ultimately stirring in its human dignity. And I feel like that whole description of The Grapes of Wrath could really be given for just about any John Steinbeck book. He writes about humanity and the human cause in such a way that moves you deeply to the core, and yet, like I've said, leaves you with almost a sense of hope in the end. He just writes with such dignity, and I find Steinbeck's writing to be some of the most accessible writing out of all of the classics. He is with that lost generation group of writers with Hemingway and Fitzgerald and John Dos Passos and all of those writers, Gertrude Stein. But I feel like if you take a good chunk of what we now consider the classical writers, John Steinbeck's prose is simplistic in the best possible way. It's not simple in that it is in its themes. It's very, very complex in its themes, yet the way that he actually writes, the words that he uses are simple in a way that anyone at any kind of education level can read it and get something out of it and relate to it. And I feel like more people need to read John Steinbeck's writing and appreciate it for what it is on the page. I just feel like it goes so underappreciated. So my last occurrence of John Steinbeck's writing was very recent, just this last couple of weeks. The beginning of August, I read Travels with Charley, which was a travel memoir by John Steinbeck about his journey across the U.S. with his dog, Charley. And this book was so endearing to me. You have honest observations of Steinbeck as he travels across the U.S. and meets various people in various places, but unlike his other works, you get a really good amount of humor in this book. You get those deep, impactful moments, but also, just like every other John Steinbeck book, you get moments of hope. There's moments of levity in here and humor sprinkled throughout the book that I was not expecting. I didn't know how funny John Steinbeck could be until I read this book. Now, just like every other book of its day, this is a book of its day. You have moments of racism, you have moments of sexism, but that's just because of John Steinbeck's honest way of writing. He's not going to censor his writing. He's going to write it how it came across to him. And some people in the 1960s were just like that. Let's face it. There are some people today that are like that. Issues and moments that John Steinbeck writes about in Travels with Charley, people are still fighting for these moments of equality today in 2023. So while yes, it is a product of its time, I feel like this book is a great snapshot of the 1960s in America. I don't know that I would say this is a great entryway for Steinbeck. If you just want to read a John Steinbeck book and not go any further, you're just looking for any John Steinbeck book that's a little bit more lighthearted, this is a great book to go with that. But if you're looking for an entryway into Steinbeck, a book that will give you a glimpse of what his writing is like, this book, I feel like, even though it's amazing and I absolutely loved it, Travels with Charley is not a great representation of all of John Steinbeck's writing because we don't get a lot of that humor throughout his other books. There are humorous moments and funny moments in Of Mice and Men and even The Grapes of Wrath, but those are not funny books. Whereas this, I would say, has so much humor in it that it kind of is a totally different form of John Steinbeck's writing. Now, other John Steinbeck books that I want to read someday, there's a lot because it's weird because when I think about John Steinbeck, I think of The Pearl, I think of Mice and Men, of course, The Grapes of Wrath. I think of East of Eden, which is one that I do want to get to sooner rather than later. And now I think of Travels with Charley. But there's a whole other list of books that I want to get to written by John Steinbeck. Canary Road, Tortilla Flat, The Red Pony, The Winter of Discontent, and The Moon is Down. So those are some John Steinbeck books that I hope to get to soon. We'll see when I can actually get to them. Probably the shorter ones sooner rather than later. Let me know in the comments below if you've read John Steinbeck outside of the assigned reading. Which did you enjoy the most? Which book by John Steinbeck did you enjoy the most? Which did you get the most out of? If you read John Steinbeck in school as assigned reading, but then came back later to it in life, did you get more out of it when you came back to it as an older adult? Or did you react to it the same way you did when you were reading it in school? Did you love it in school just like I did? I'd love to know all your thoughts on John Steinbeck or who you think is an accessible classic writer just like Steinbeck is. Let me know all of your thoughts in the comments below. As always, my Patreon and my Discord information will be in the description below. Keep reading, and I love y'all to the moon and back. Bye.